Join me as we unlock the stories of the past, turning the pages of history to discover the vibrant lives, struggles, and triumphs that have shaped our world. Tonight, your journey begins not in a palace or battlefield, but somewhere far grittier and infinitely more fermented. Imagine it's late evening. The cobblestones are slick with rain and waste, and your boots squelch unpleasantly with each step. Your hood is soaked through. The wind snakes into your sleeves, but just ahead through the curling fog, you see it a flicker of warm orange light leaking from warped wooden shutters. There's the dull thump of a lute string, a slurred burst of laughter, and the unmistakable whiff of stale ale. That's the tavern. And against your better judgment, you reach for the crooked iron latch. The door creaks open, and at once the sound swells. Clattering wooden bowls, grunted arguments. The bark of a dog you can't see but definitely smell. Someone singing loudly and badly. You're hit by a wave of heat smoke and something that might be mutton. Might also be wet goat. Your eyes water. You blink. Welcome to a medieval alehouse. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please post your location and local time. I love knowing where in the world we're falling asleep together. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not alone in the doorway. Other travelers jostle past you, mud-caked boots, patched cloaks clanking coin purses or clinking belts. One wears a pilgrim's badge pinned to his hood, indicating he's just come from the shrine of St. Edmund and smells like he hasn't bathed since. A woman near the fire is breastfeeding a red-faced baby while shouting at someone you hope isn't her husband. It's unclear who works here and who simply hasn't left in 3 days. The fire at the center smolders under a blackened iron pot, its contents burping every few minutes in a way that suggests they've been simmering since last week. The tavern isn't especially big. Most weren't, but the low ceilings and soot-caked beams make it feel closer still, like a drunken cousin breathing in your face. Benches sag under the weight of heavy men and heavier meals. Dogs nose around underfoot for dropped scraps. A chicken flutters across the floor, startling no one. You find a corner, half sit on a cracked stool, and do your best not to touch anything sticky, which is everything. Now, let's pause to clarify one thing. Medieval taverns, inns, and alehouses weren't all the same. Technically, a tavern served wine, an alehouse sold, you guessed it, ale, and an inn offered overnight lodging. But in practice, the lines blurred faster than a tankard of unfiltered beer. Most people simply called it the place you get drunk and don't die well, not immediately. Here's a mainstream historical fact: to toss in taverns were often licensed and monitored by local authorities, especially after the 13th century, when municipal governments realized just how much tax revenue and trouble these places generated. But that didn't stop illegal alehouses from popping up in side streets run by widows' monks or even bakers moonlighting as brewers. You scan the patrons. There's a man in a faded green tunic playing a bone flute. Two boys arm wrestling with more enthusiasm than technique. And in the far corner, a group of men hunched around a game board, possibly playing tables, an ancestor of backgammon, or possibly just arguing about cheese. Someone has tied their horse to a ceiling beam. You pretend not to notice. The innkeeper spots you and makes his way over. He's large, balding, and missing 2 fingers. You don't ask why. His apron is more grease than cloth, and his smile looks practiced, like someone who's seen one too many unpaid tabs. He grunts ale or wine in a tone that suggests both are a gamble. You ask for ale. He nods. You don't specify warm, cold, light, or dark because, well, this isn't a microbrewery. He disappears behind a barrel. Now's a good time to mention the vessel your drink will come in. Not glass. Definitely not pewter. Likely a simple wooden mug, or perhaps a ceramic cup glazed with lead yes lead. A fringe tidbit, some of these mugs had whistles carved into the rim, so regulars could signal for refills without shouting. Hence the phrase, wet your whistle. Possibly. Historians still argue whether that's a folk myth or etymological gold. Your ale arrives. It's frothy room temperature and slightly gritty. It tastes like sour bread and old socks. But you're freezing tired and possibly hallucinating, so you sip it gratefully. And you feel it, that faint warmth spreading through your chest like a candle lighting behind your ribs. At a table nearby, a woman flips over a card with a flourish. She's reading fortunes or pretending to. Her client, a thick-necked tanner, stares at the card like it's cursed. Another fringe tidbit, fortune-telling in alehouses was common, and while illegal in many towns, it thrived in dim corners over drinks. You might get your palm read with suspicious accuracy, or just robbed. Suddenly the door bursts open again. A gust of wind scatters ashes from the hearth. Everyone glances up. It's just a shepherd soaked and steaming his cloak, speckled with something that's hopefully mud. He nods. No one replies. That's as close to friendly as tavern greetings get. The shepherd finds a spot, the dog curls up again, and the lute starts up once more. The chords are crooked, but the rhythm's familiar. You find yourself swaying slightly, ale warming your limbs. You're no longer the newest arrival. You belong here now in this strange stew of sweat song and centuries of fermenting history. And that's the thing. For all its grime and chaos, the tavern is more than a place to drink. It's a living scrapbook, a bulletin board, a courtroom stage and church rolled into one, just with fewer rules and more rodents. You lean back, careful not to tip your stool. Someone refills your cup without asking. A minstrel begins a song you don't know, but hum along to anyway. And for the first time all day, you feel something close to comfort. Just don't fall asleep here. They'll either charge you rent or sell your shoes. You wake up, no, not from sleep, but from the lull of warm ale, and realize your cup is nearly empty. The bitter foam clings to the rim like an old man to a good grudge, and your tongue feels suspiciously fuzzy. It occurs to you as the room jostles and sways in that peculiar alehouse rhythm that the stuff you just drank might not exactly meet modern health codes. But congratulations, you've survived your first sip of medieval ale. Let's talk about what you just swallowed. In the Middle Ages, people drank ale like modern folks drink water. Mostly because the water would kill you faster. Brewing required boiling, which helped sterilize it, and the low alcohol content, especially in the ubiquitous small ale, meant you could sip it all day without keeling over. Well, in theory. Your tolerance may vary. Mainstream fact incoming by the 13th century towns across England and continental Europe had strict laws about ale quality prices and who could sell it. In England, the assize of ale was passed as early as 1267. It wasn't a nightly jousting tournament, it was a regulatory system to standardize ale pricing and punish dishonest brewers. Spoiler, nearly everyone broke the rules. The drink in your hand likely has no hops. That's right. Hops, the now essential bittering agents in beer, didn't become widespread in English brewing until the 15th or 16th century. Earlier ales were flavored with a mix of herbs known as Gruta blend that might include yarrow rosemary bog, myrtle, or whatever the local hedge witch wasn't using that week. Tastes ranged from earthy and spice to fermented compost heap. You sip again and feel brave. At the next table, a man sneezes violently into his bowl of porridge and keeps eating. He raises his mug to no one in particular, then downs it like it's medicine. Which, in a way, it was. Ale provided calories, hydration, and minor escape from the 14th century plague-ridden chaos outside. Now, here's a quirky tidbit for you monasteries brewed some of the finest ale in the land. Monks weren't just scribbling manuscripts, they were fermenting some top-shelf stuff. Their brews were thicker, stronger, and often flavored with exotic ingredients like coriander or even imported spices from distant lands. It wasn't uncommon for a weary pilgrim to stagger into a monastery seeking both spiritual and liquid salvation. But not all ale was created equal. Remember that this wasn't a Budweiser branded world. Brewing happened in kitchen cellars and sheds. Your drink tonight was probably made a few days ago in a backroom vat and stored in wooden casks prone to leaks, mold, and mysterious floating bits. The alewife, likely the innkeeper's wife or daughter, brewed it as part of her domestic duties, tasting for spoilage by dipping her finger in and listening for fizz. Seriously. And yes, women ran the brewing scene for centuries. They were the original brewsters, and many made a respectable living off it, until regulations, taxation, and male-dominated guilds squeezed them out. Historians still argue whether the decline of the alewife tradition was due to economic shifts, religious backlash, or sheer patriarchal interference. Probably all three. Sound familiar? You glance over at a crooked chalkboard above the hearth. It lists three crude drawings: a horn, a loaf, and a dripping mug. These aren't just doodles, they're the tavern's signs of service. Since most patrons were illiterate symbols like a sheaf of wheat or a foaming tankard were the medieval version of a neon open sign. A child ducks past you chasing a dog with a chicken foot in its mouth. Nobody flinches. You assume this is part of the floor show. Now let's return to your mug. Feel the heft of it in your hand. It's a wooden vessel, maybe with iron hoops holding it together. Or perhaps it's ceramic handmade by a local potter whose kiln you can still smell on the breeze. If you're truly unlucky, it's lined with lead glaze. In that case, your dreams tonight might include headaches and hallucinations. But hey, welcome to the 1300s. Across the room, someone shouts "Skål," a Norse toast, still echoing centuries after Viking ale horns clink together. Others just grunt or thump their mugs. Communal drinking was more than a pastime. It was a bonding ritual. Taverns were where contracts were signed, marriages were arranged, feuds were settled and occasionally reignited. A man sidles up next to you and offers a refill. His teeth are a distant memory and his breath is deeply herbal, like a compost bin that tried chewing on mint. He tells you the brew is stronger now. This one's for the reeve, he says, which might be a joke, a threat, or both. You nod politely. You do not ask follow-up questions. Let's sneak in one more fringe tidbit. Some alehouses used ale conners, official tasters employed by the crown or town council, to test ale quality. Their job: sample a tavern's brew, then sit in a puddle of it literally to see if their leather breeches stuck to the bench. If the seat was sticky, it meant too much sugar was left unfermented. Translation: the brewer cut corners. Yes, early consumer protection was tactile. You're welcome. At your elbow, someone sloshes their drink in celebration. You ask what for. They say it's St. Arnold's feast day. You smile vaguely. Later, you realize St. Arnold is the patron saint of hop pickers and brewers. He once said, "Don't drink the water, drink the beer." That man understood the assignment. Just then, a fight breaks out over a spilled drink. Two men rise, stagger, and collide more with gravity than rage. They wrestle like sacks of flour. No weapons are drawn. A stool breaks. A dog yelps. Within minutes, it's over, and both combatants are laughing and sharing whatever remains of their respective ales. One of them probably has a concussion, No one seems concerned. You look down at your hands. They're sticky now. Everything is. Your sleeve smells like broth and beer, and you're not sure which part is worse. Still, your stomach has settled. Your fingers tingle. The room sways in a slow musical rhythm. The candlelight catches on tankards and wet boots flickering like fireflies on a bog. You notice someone asleep at the bar, head down, snoring softly, mug still in hand. The innkeeper doesn't budge, probably because once the snorer wakes up, they'll owe another coin. In this small, smoke-clogged room, you see the world. Travelers, locals, monks, merchants, beggars, maybe even a disguised noble slumming it for the thrill. They drink the same brew, sit on the same benches, complain about the same taxes. Their mugs may differ, their prayers might not rhyme, but here for now, they're part of the same fermenting brew of humanity. So go ahead, tip back the last sip, let it warm your belly. You've made it through your first mug of medieval ale without losing a limb, your purse, or your dignity. Well, 2 out of 3 is not bad. The innkeeper's footsteps echo faintly on the warped floorboards as he circles the room, like a sleepy lion pacing his den. He eyes everything the ale levels, the noise levels, the suspiciously unsteady guests teetering near his prized wooden beams. His gaze lingers longest on the hearth where too many elbows rest too close to the fire. This is his tavern, you're just passing through it. You watch him move a bulky man with a permanent scowl carved into his features, equal parts exhaustion and calculation. His apron is stained from decades of splash stew, old wine, and who knows what else. His knuckles are swollen like split chestnuts. His eyebrows twitch when someone laughs too loudly. You quickly learn in this house his word is law and the punishment for disrespect is swift, silent, and usually involves a mop or a broom handle. It's easy to assume the medieval innkeeper is just a beer slinger. But truth is, he's part bartender, part accountant, part peacekeeper, and all-powerful gossip hub. He knows who's in town before the local reeve does. He knows who owes money, who's cheating on whom, and who just fled a monastery after misplacing a reliquary. Mainstream fact. Many tavern owners, especially in towns along trade routes, were required to keep written logs of travelers and visitors. These weren't just for local records, but tools for surveillance. Governments wanted to know who came and went, and innkeepers. They were the gatekeepers of that intelligence, often paid to report anything suspicious. You sip slowly now. Your drink's cooled, but the warmth of the fire and the quiet hum of tavern life keep you comfortable. Across from you, the innkeeper negotiates with a merchant about lodging fees. The merchant gestures at his satchel and throws down a coin. The innkeeper lifts it, bites it, and drops it into a pouch hanging from his belt with the sound that makes everyone nearby glance up. Coin sounds travel in here. Fast. Here's a quirky tidbit: in smaller towns, taverns doubled as banks. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to leave coin purses with the innkeeper, trusting him more than the local authorities. Some taverns even offered locked chests for overnight storage for a fee, of course. Trust in medieval terms was always transactional. A boy appears from the back, possibly the innkeeper's son or maybe a hired orphan carrying a chipped wooden bowl. He slips it under a guest's nose, mumbles something that could be supper, and scampers away before questions can be asked. The stew steams ominously. You catch a whiff of leek and onion and maybe fish, or not fish, possibly shoe. The innkeeper circles again, this time stopping to shoo a dog off a bench. The dog growls. The man growls louder. The bench is reclaimed. You notice something else: everyone defers to him even when drunk, especially when drunk. The staggering laborer who knocked over a jug bows his head in apology. The minstrel stops mid-tune when the innkeeper raises a finger. Even the clergyman in the corner nursing what is clearly not water keeps his voice low when the big man walks by. Why so much fear? Simple. This man can cut you off, and not just from ale, from lodging, from fire warmth, from protection. In towns and villages where the next inn might be 12 miles away through wolf-infested woods, that's no small threat. And let's be honest, he probably has friends on the town council and a cousin in the sheriff's office. Taverns aren't just social hubs, they're micro-kingdoms. Another fringe tidbit: many tavern owners were also landlords, literally. The alehouse was often attached to their home farm or even a small stable business, which means the mug in your hand helps pay for a horse, a chimney sweep, and 3 dozen chickens that live somewhere behind the cabbage patch. You glance toward the hearth again, where a small group now gathers around a low table. They whisper. One man keeps looking over his shoulder. The innkeeper pretends not to see them, but positions himself just close enough to listen. You wonder how many secrets he's overheard, how many he's sold. And then you spotted a small wooden tally stick near the bar, notched with careful marks. These aren't decoration. That stick records credit. In a world where coins are scarce, tavern tabs are real and tracked with primitive, surprisingly effective accounting systems. Split sticks marked bones or etched clay tablets. The innkeeper doesn't forget a debt. Ever. There's a story circulating, probably apocryphal, about a man who tried to skip town after a week of drinking on borrowed coin. The innkeeper didn't chase him. He didn't shout. He simply waited. 3 days later, the man returned. Why? Because the roads were worse. The weather turned, and he realized no other inn would shelter him without word from this one. The innkeeper gave him a mug, a mop, and a week to work it off. A scholar might call it a medieval credit system. You just call it effective. Let's return to the man himself for a moment. You wonder how old he is. 40, 60. Ageless in that medieval way where everyone looks prematurely haunted. His hands are never idle. He refills mugs, clears tables, adjusts candles. When two patrons begin arguing about the price of boiled turnips, he appears instantly, says one word, enough, and the argument dies like a candle in rain. Historians still argue whether tavern owners held formal power in their communities or were just informally feared. But one thing's clear: in their own establishments, they were monarchs of mischief, masters of revelry, and judges of drunken disputes. They were also some of the best informed people in town, which makes sense. You can learn a lot from the bottom of a mug. The fire crackles behind you. The night presses against the walls. Someone drops a spoon and it rolls across the uneven floor like a silver beetle. The innkeeper steps over it, already moving on to the next task, the next whispered conversation, the next calculation of coin and consequence. You've barely spoken to him, but already you respect him, maybe fear him a little. And despite the grime, the noise, the constant thrum of barely controlled chaos, you feel something strange: safety. This man watches everything, which means you don't have to. Not tonight. So you sip your drink, pull your cloak a little tighter, and lean back on the creaky bench. Outside, the wind howls like a hungry beast, but in here, under the innkeeper's careful eye, you're warm, you're foolish, and for now, you're untouchable. Just don't forget to pay your tab. Somewhere near the hearth, a voice rises, not loud but clear and commanding. A woman, apron tied snug hair wrapped tightly under a linen coif, wipes her hands on her skirts and glares down a trio of red-faced men, squabbling over who called whom a swine first. They go silent. One mutters an apology. The others nod. And just like that, she turns, lifts a steaming jug of ale with both hands, and carries it to the next table without missing a step. Meet the alewife, and no, she's not just the innkeeper's better half. She may well be the tavern. In the medieval world, brewing wasn't just women's work, it was women's power. Before hops took over and beer became a man's domain, ale was part of the domestic economy. Brewed in kitchens, served in doorways, sold from jugs to neighbors and strangers alike, ale was how countless women fed their families, built reputations, and occasionally caused scandal. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In England during the 13th and 14th centuries, most brewers were women known as brewsters or alewives. Town records across London, Norwich, and York are filled with their names. Agnes, Alice, Matilda, each one fined praised or noted for the strength or suspicious thinness of her ale. Some brewed in batches so large they needed apprentices or hired help, operating more like small businesses than kitchen hobbies. You glance around this tavern again with new eyes. The man behind the counter. Perhaps he owns the building, but the ale in your cup, the bread on your trencher, the dried herbs in the fire, she's the one behind them. You suspect she's already sized you up, your muddy boots, your travel-wrinkled cloak, your uncertain posture. She knows what kind of drinker you are. She knows when to smile, when to scold, and when to quietly suggest the door. You watch as she rations out another round. Her movements are efficient but never rushed. Her gaze flicks to the boy by the door who's been eyeing unattended coin. A sharp look. He slinks away. She says nothing. Now here's a quirky tidbit: some alewives became so successful and notorious, they appeared in popular poems and sermons. The Tale of Baron, a 15th century pseudo-Chaucerian tale, features a no-nonsense alewife who robs and humiliates a pilgrim. Other alewives were accused of witchcraft, not for boiling bats in cauldrons, but for brewing stronger than average ale or manipulating customers with a wink and a tankard. Medieval misogyny, it seems, fermented just as quickly as the drink. She passes by you now, basket in hand, checking mugs with one glance. Yours gets a nod, still drinking. She moves on. You notice a carved stick hanging near the bar. It's notched like a ladder. This is her brewing tally, a record of recent batches. Some alewives tied brooms or garlands to their doors to signal a fresh brew is ready. This tradition gave us the pub barbershop pole equivalent. And when the ale ran dry, the sign came down. No arguments. You hear two men nearby debating the brew's strength. One swears it's watered down. The other swears he's seeing double. You smile. Brewing wasn't a precise science back then. Every batch varied wildly. Factors like weather grain quality, fermentation time, and how drunk the brewer was during mixing could all affect the outcome. And yes, that includes the likelihood of mild hallucinations. Let's pause for one more fringe tidbit. Some scholars suggest the classic witch image pointed hat. Cauldron cat may have roots in alewife attire. The hat made women visible in busy marketplaces. The cauldron brewing gear. The cat pest control in grain stores. Even the broomstick may have started as a brewing signal left outside the home. Historians still argue whether this connection is literal or symbolic. Either way, the overlap is hard to ignore. A ruckus erupts in the back corner. The alewife doesn't flinch. She shouts once Garth, and a man rises from the bench. Garth, presumably. He grabs a stool leg and heads toward the noise with a grin that says he's done this before. You get the feeling that while the innkeeper may rule by presence, the alewife governs by precision and volume. You're handed a hunk of bread now, coarse, dark, maybe a day or two, past its best but warm. You glance to the woman by the fire who nods once, then turns away, already dealing with another customer. It's not charity, it's management. She likely keeps the books too. While many tavern keepers were illiterate, some Alewives had scribes write contracts, record debts, and draft marriage or labor arrangements. In towns where the local sheriff drank in her taproom, an alewife could wield more influence than a bishop's scribe. Yet not everyone approved. By the 15th century, as ale brewing shifted toward hop-infused beer and large-scale operations, men began dominating the trade. Guilds and brewing corporations almost exclusively male tightened regulations, pushing women out of what had once been their territory. Clergy preached that alewives led men astray, that their laughter was dangerous, their hospitality sinful. In one sermon, an alewife is literally dragged into hell by demons for pouring strong ale and telling dirty jokes. Honestly, she sounds like someone you'd invite to every party, and yet they endured. Many alewives passed their skills to daughters or nieces. Brewing secrets stayed within families. Recipes were memorized, adjusted, whispered over grain sacks. They brewed through wars, plagues, famines, keeping towns hydrated when wells dried up or became lethal. For every wandering monk or petty official, there was a woman by the fire stirring mash and watching the bubbles rise. You sip your drink again. Still good, a bit sour, but satisfying. The alewife crosses back into view. This time she pauses just long enough to pluck a strand of hay from your sleeve and say, "Careful where you lean. That bench bites." Then she vanishes, laughter in her wake. You look at the bench. It has splinters. She's not wrong. The fire pops softly. Another round is being poured. She's already 3 steps ahead, adding a pinch of something to the next batch. Maybe rosemary, maybe something you shouldn't ask about. She tastes it, nods, and slides the jug toward a waiting traveler. You think about how many mugs she's poured in her life, how many secrets she's overheard, how many nights she's kept from falling apart with nothing but instinct and boiled barley. Tonight she's running the show. Tomorrow she'll do it again. And centuries from now, someone will sip a pint, mutter cheers, and have no idea they owe it all to her. You didn't expect the smell to hit quite so hard. Not the warm, comforting scent of roasted meat or the pleasant, yeasty note of baking bread. No, what strikes you in the face like a damp sock to the nose is something more layered. A complex perfume of sweat, smoke, stale ale, damp wool, grease, spilled stew-wet dog, and a top note of mystery meat left too close to the hearth for too long. It's the scent of a medieval tavern, and there's absolutely no escape. Even in the heart of winter, when windows are shuttered tight and the only fresh air is a memory from autumn, this smell hangs thick in the air like a sour fog. The thatched roof does little to trap the heat, but excels at trapping every single odor released by the humans and animals within. You shift on your bench, careful to avoid the spot where someone recently vomited someone who may now be cheerfully singing by the fire because shame works differently here. You try breathing through your mouth. That doesn't help. Now you taste the smell. You give up. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval taverns didn't have chimneys, at least not until the 12th or 13th century, and even then they were rare in rural areas. Smoke from the hearth had to escape through a hole in the roof, meaning it first passed through you, your hair, your cloak, your lungs. And that hearth was used for everything heating, cooking, lighting, and drying wet shoes, or wet dogs, or wet rats if you're unlucky. The walls are dark, not painted that way, but stained from generations of greasy fingers, soot, and human exhalation. The wooden beams above are barely visible beneath the accumulated grime, and the floor is more sawdust than board. The sawdust isn't for comfort, it's to soak up spilled ale blood and various unmentionables. Now, for a fringe tidbit, some taverns were deliberately scented, though not in the way you're hoping. The alewife might burn herbs like rosemary, lavender, or juniper to mask the more offensive smells. but these were rare and expensive. More commonly, the strongest scent in the room came from tallow candles, cheap, fatty animal-based lights that smelled faintly of old stew and regret. You reach for your mug again, mostly to have something to do with your hands. The ale smells marginally better than the air, and it's starting to make the overall atmosphere more bearable. Or maybe you're just going nose blind. Hard to say. Behind you, a man pulls off his boots. A wet squelch accompanies the act. Everyone nearby grimaces but says nothing. The boots go under the bench. The man stretches his toes toward the fire, releasing a scent that can only be described as historic. A dog growls softly, offended on behalf of all noses. You start noticing just how many people smell like livestock. Not because they're unclean, though, well, but because many literally live with their animals. In rural areas, it would be common for families to share space with pigs, goats, or chickens for warmth. Some of that scent clings, strongly, permanently. It travels with them like a ghost, and now it's in the tavern too. And yet there's something strangely comforting about it all. This olfactory chaos, this symphony of survival, it smells like people who've worked, walked, toiled, bled, and earned their rest. It smells like stories, like laughter echoing in warm shadows, like life at its most raw. Quirky tidbit incoming some patrons brought their own straw to sleep on in taverns and inns. They'd lay it on the floor beside the fire, or if lucky, in the loft above. But over time, these guest straws became soggy, dirty, and filled with lice. Taverns rarely changed them. Some simply swept new straw on top. It was the medieval version of putting a clean towel over a filthy mattress. The man with the boots is snoring now. His foot twitches each time someone steps near. A woman passes holding her skirts high to avoid a puddle of what you hope is ale. You wonder when was the last time this floor was cleaned. Then you realize the answer is probably never. Not properly. Cleanliness in the modern sense wasn't really a goal. Taverns were scrubbed with stale beer sprinkled with ashes or lime or left to air out once a year when the weather permitted. Still, historians still argue whether medieval people were truly dirty by their own standards. Bathing wasn't unheard of. Soap existed animal fat and lye mixed with herbs often used more for laundry than skin. And people did care about smells, just not the way we do. A peasant might complain about a neighbor's foul breath or a tanner's pits, but wood smoke, body odor, and dung, that was just background noise. You adjust your cloak again, but it's already picked up the tavern's perfume. Congratulations, your wool now smells like sweat ale smoke and toasted onions. It's not coming out. Ever. You'll be reminded of this night every time you wear it. A scratch and sniff memory. Another candle sputters out. The air feels thicker now, like breathing soup. Your eyes sting slightly, but you're too tired to care. Across the room, a traveler unpacks a pouch and sprinkles dried rose petals onto his lapel. A vain attempt at freshness. Someone sneezes violently nearby, and half the room mutters a prayer. And now one last fringe tidbit for the night: some people carried pomanders, tiny perforated balls filled with spices, herbs, or dried flowers. Worn around the neck or tied to belts, these medieval air fresheners were a defense against both bad smells and bad spirits. In plague years, people stuffed them with vinegar-soaked cloth or camphor, hoping to ward off death with cinnamon and cloves. You don't have a pomander. You have a cup of lukewarm ale and your own resilience. And miraculously, you're still upright. The smell hasn't killed you yet. And in the strangest twist, as your nose finally adjusts or gives up entirely, you catch something else beneath the stench. Baking bread. Someone must have slipped a loaf into the ashes of the hearth, letting it slow cook under a layer of hot embers. The scent is faint, almost imaginary, but it's there. You breathe it in, eyes half closed. The fire crackles. The dog sighs. Someone coughs into their elbow and mutters a prayer to Saint Zita, patron saint of domestic workers and probably tavern cleaners, too. You're still here, still conscious, still amused. And somehow, in this boiling vat of human smells and candle soot, you find yourself smiling. Because this is the real scent of history. You're beginning to understand that nothing in this tavern is accidental, not even the seating. You shift on your stool, which rocks slightly on the uneven floorboards, and realize that you're spot half shadowed. Near the hearth, but not directly beside it, wasn't just what was left. No, this is a low-ranking seat, and you're now part of the tavern's unsung hierarchy. Welcome to the social chessboard of the medieval alehouse, where who you sit beside, how you sit, and even what you sit on sends a message louder than any slurred toast. Let's start with the obvious. The best seats are the long benches close to the fire or pressed against a wall, offering both warmth and a solid backing ideal for those worried about pickpockets or rivals with knives. These are taken early, held by regulars or those with money influence, or an imposing enough scowl to claim them without question. You, traveler, got the rickety stool with one short leg which squeaks every time you shift. Consider it your initiation. Mainstream historical fact social status was deeply visible in every aspect of medieval life, and the tavern was no exception. In wealthier inns, there were even designated seating areas for different classes. Merchants at the high tables, pilgrims near the doors, laborers on backless benches near the stables. In smaller alehouses like this one, it's subtler but still present in every glance gesture and mug placement. You look around and notice it clearly now. The boisterous men by the hearth. Locals. One wears a leather apron still streaked with soot, probably a blacksmith. Another has rings on his fingers and an elaborate feather in his hat. Merchants, maybe, or gamblers. Their stools are solid, wide, and mostly clean. A woman sits confidently beside them, laughing too hard, and refilling their mugs without asking. She might be a tavern girl. She might also be their boss. Meanwhile, in the darker corner, three figures sit apart. Their cloaks are rough spun. One has a clubfoot. Another clutches a pewter flask like it's sacred. They speak little and drink slow. Their table leans dramatically, propped up by a stack of flat stones. Then there's the floating crowd travelers like you, arriving late and hunting for perches near walls or on overturned buckets. One man sits on a burlap sack. Another squats by the door arms, resting on his knees, occasionally passing a coin to the innkeeper for a sip from a shared mug. And yes, there is indeed shared mug culture here. You spot two men taking turns drinking from the same battered vessel. Not out of camaraderie, but economics. One coin, one drink, two mouths. Now, a quirky tidbit in wealthier taverns, especially near universities or towns with cathedral schools. Some seats were reserved with chalk symbols or wooden nameplates, a medieval version of a VIP booth. One Oxford alehouse even had a sign over a bench reading, "Scholars only." Others pay double. You suspect it wasn't a joke. You shift again. Your stool wobbles with theatrical defiance. A woman nearby whispers something to her companion and glances at you. Not unkindly, just curious. Maybe she's wondering what kind of guest you are. A pilgrim. A fugitive. A poet. In here, identity is fluid, but your posture gives you away. You're watching the room too closely. First-timer energy. Suddenly a loud splat. Someone's stew has fallen. Or rather, someone has knocked over their trencher, a thick, flat slab of day-old bread, meant to hold meat or broth. Unlike plates, trenchers were edible, disposable, and usually a bit moldy by design. The one now lying on the floor is soaked with something brown and stringy. The owner, a wiry man with a bandage on his brow, sighs and eyes the dog who is already licking it. No one offers to help. Instead, another man nearby tears a chunk off his own trencher and tosses it across the table with a grunt. That's generosity here, a quiet, crusty gesture. Fringe tidbit incoming: some wealthier taverns reused trenchers not to eat but as pig feed or alms for the poor. In monastic alehouses, trenchers were often collected at the end of meals and distributed to lepers or beggars waiting by the gates. A grim but efficient version of room service. Your own trencher arrives shortly after, its hard as a shield, steaming slightly, topped with a lumpy stew of uncertain contents. You poke it cautiously. Something floats that may once have been a bean, possibly a snail. You eat around it. Seating, you now realize, also dictates service. Those closer to the fire are served first. The innkeeper gives them full mugs, fresher bread, better chunks of meat. Your corner gets what's left, less about quality control and more about access control. The farther from the tap, the colder the ale. You get the feeling this rule applies to news, gossip, and opportunities too. The minstrel starts a new tune, something fast with finger snaps and off-key harmonies. Two men stomp their boots in rhythm. A girl claps out of sync. Even the innkeeper's brow softens. You tap your foot against your stool's wobbly leg, pretending it's deliberate. And then you see something that makes you pause. A newcomer has entered and is being waved toward one of the good seats. He's young, well-dressed, with clean boots and a ring on his finger. But the regulars don't sneer. They nod. Someone even moves aside to make space. Why? Because he's a known patron, a regular, a good tipper, or someone's cousin. Maybe he's told excellent jokes, picked up too many rounds, or simply survived enough brawls to earn respect. The tavern, you now realize, has its own memory. Reputation lives in its walls. Where you sit tonight isn't just about coin, it's about who you've been and what you've done in this room. Historians still argue whether tavern hierarchies reflected wider feudal structures or created their own miniature democracies. In truth, it was probably both. A knight and a tanner might sit at the same bench if they drank equally well. But insult the innkeeper, spill a drink on the wrong guest, you'll be standing for the rest of your visit. You lift your mug, lean back, and accept your seat for what it is. Humble, splintery, a little sticky, but yours, for now. And as someone lets loose a belch loud enough to shake the beams, and someone else toasts to St. Bridget and burnt onions, you find yourself oddly content. Because while status matters here, so does presence. You showed up, you drank, you learned the rhythm, and with enough coin, laughter, and luck, next time you might just earn a better seat. But only if you don't fall off this one first. In the farthest corner of the tavern, behind a curtain of shadows and smoke, you hear the unmistakable sound of dice hitting wood. Not the playful rattle of innocent fun, but a sharp, anxious clatter that suggests money is changing hands and someone's about to get angry. You lean forward slightly, just enough to watch. A group of men, 3-4, sit hunched around a barrel, posing as a table. One has a velvet pouch tied to his belt. Another wears a crooked cap and chews a toothpick like it owes him money. Their eyes rarely blink. Their hands never stop moving. Welcome to gambling in the Medieval Tavern, where fortunes turn faster than a rolling die, and cheaters vanish into the night or into the nearest river. Mainstream fact: to start us off, gambling was extremely common in medieval taverns, and equally frowned upon by authorities. Kings, bishops, and town councils all issued regular bans on dice games, not because they were inherently wicked, but because they distracted soldiers, drained apprentices of their wages, and led to a surprising number of fistfights involving poultry. You watch as the velvet pouch man throws a pair of knuckle bones, real bones often from sheep or goats, shaped and polished to land in specific positions. The game could be anything from hazard, a precursor to modern craps, to something more regional and less rule-based. The other men watch with hawk-like intensity. There's a shout, a groan. A pile of coins more than you've seen all day is scraped across the barrel top and vanishes into the winner's hand. It happens fast, too fast. One man stands abruptly. Another accuses him of cheating. The knuckle bones are examined, passed around, sniffed for reasons unclear. A tavern boy appears eyes wide, then vanishes. Probably to fetch the innkeeper. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some gamblers traveled from tavern to tavern, professionally surviving purely off dice games and charm. They were known as dicers, and many carried loaded dice, sleight of hand tricks, or even backup brawlers. In some towns, being caught with marked bones could get you fined or publicly flogged. One of the men at the barrel slams his palm on the table so hard a mug tips over. The innkeeper is already walking over, slow and steady, not angry, but heavy like a thundercloud about to rain discipline. He says nothing, just looks. The tension melts in seconds. Coins are grudgingly returned. The knuckle bones vanish back into their pouch. The velvet man raises his hands in mock surrender, grinning too wide. The others grumble, but sit down again. The game resumes, slightly more polite this time. You sip your drink and reflect. The tavern is a pressure valve, a place where people let off steam, test luck, and play out fantasies of risk and reward. But it's also a trap, a slow spiral where enough losses can turn a night of fun into a week of hunger. Not all games are dice-based either. Just beside you, a pair of younger men are playing something on a carved wooden board tables, an ancestor of backgammon. Small round tokens click against each other as they slide and collide. One of the men hums while he plays. The other stares with intense concentration. People bet on this too, though, in smaller amounts. Wagers could be anything: a coin, a loaf of bread, a kiss, a night's lodging. In one recorded case, a man bet and lost his own shoes. Fringe tidbit for you: in 14th century England, archers were banned from dice games, particularly on Sundays, because the crown feared it distracted them from practicing their longbow skills. The king didn't care if you lost your savings, he just wanted to make sure you could shoot a Frenchman in the eye at 200 paces. You glance again at the velvet pouch gambler. He's smiling now, winning again. Probably too much. Someone nearby whispers that his dice are blessed. Someone else says cursed. Another claims he once saw the man lose everything in Canterbury, only to win it back the next day with a song and a borrowed cloak. You ask if anyone knows his name. They laugh. Names don't last in games, says the toothpick man. Just debts. The dice roll again. The clatter is addictive. You consider playing, just once. Just a single coin for the thrill of it. And then you remember nobody ever rolls once. You shift back on your stool and watch instead. Across the tavern, a different kind of game begins. A crowd is forming near the hearth where a burly man and a skinny boy begin arm wrestling on a low table. The burly man growls like a bear. The boy looks frightened until he wins. The crowd erupts. Coins change hands again. Laughter rings out, even the innkeeper cracks a grin. You realize gambling here is less about money and more about performance tension and the illusion of control. Everyone wants to feel lucky. Everyone wants to believe fate can be tricked even just for a night. Historians still argue whether taverns fueled crime or simply revealed it. Some say dice and drink turned honest men wicked. Others say taverns exposed the desperation already simmering beneath daily life. Maybe both are true. Maybe it depends on the role. The knuckle bones clatter again. This time the pouch man loses. He takes it well, too well. You suddenly wonder what happens when someone really cheats. Not a suspicion, not an argument, but undeniable trickery. What then? You'll find out, eventually. For now, the dice cool. The crowd shifts. A new game begins, a riddle contest by the sound of it. Two old men trading poetic questions over mugs, each trying to stump the other. The stakes. The loser buys the next round. Simple, civilized, delightful, until someone bets on the wrong man and it all spirals again. You drain the last of your ale, place your mug down gently, and feel the dice in the room still rolling in your ears. It's strange. In this loud, smoke-filled, sour-smelling place, chance feels sharper, realer. Like luck lives here, breathing beneath the floorboards, whispering in the rafters, hiding in a pouch until it decides who to favor next. You decide to keep your coins in your boot, just in case. But you keep watching the dice, because they might just roll your way next time. A lute string twangs from somewhere near the fireplace, wobbly, slightly flat, and followed by the telltale sound of someone clearing their throat in theatrical anticipation. A few heads turn. A wooden spoon clatters onto the floor. Then, without much ceremony, the song begins. It's not good. Not really. The minstrel's voice slides around the melody like a dog on ice. But it's loud, and that seems to be the more valuable trait tonight. You watch as a few patrons clap along, stomping booted feet on the floorboards in crooked rhythm. The tavern hums. Someone lets out a woozy cheer, and suddenly, just like that, entertainment hour has begun. Now let's rewind a bit. Medieval taverns didn't all have musicians, especially the smaller rural alehouses where the only performance was watching your neighbor fall off his bench. But in towns or on feast days, you might be treated to a whole range of chaotic, glorious, occasionally disastrous live acts. Mainstream historical fact: minstrels and jongleurs were the backbone of medieval tavern entertainment. Some were itinerant performers wandering from inn to inn with lutes, harps, or pipes. Others were hired for the night, paid in coin ale, or if they were truly unlucky, leftover stew. Their job to keep the patrons awake, spending and laughing, ideally all at once. The minstrel tonight wears a patchwork tunic and no shoes. His hair is wild. His smile even more so. He plucks the lute with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and sings something about a knight, a cow, and a missing boot. You lose the thread halfway through the second verse, but it doesn't seem to matter. The table closest to him is in hysterics. Now, here's a fringe tidbit. Not all performers were musicians. Some were jesters performing slapstick routines, juggling wooden spoons, or even live frogs. Others recited epic poems from memory, like The Song of Roland Beowulf, or the slightly less epic Geraint and the Cheesemonger. One man famously gained a following by doing bird calls and pretending to be a rooster for 3 minutes straight. The tavern becomes a stage, its smoky beams a theater ceiling. A man near you suddenly rises and begins tapping tankards with a spoon, adding percussion to the minstrel's chorus. Someone joins in with hand claps. Another whistles badly. It's more racket than rhythm, but somehow it works. And then, because of course it's time for dancing, a boy no older than 10 slides into the open space near the hearth and begins a sprightly jig, arms flailing, feet stomping with surprising accuracy. The room whoops in appreciation. A woman joins in, spinning her skirts, and soon 2 more follow. Before long, there's a swirling knot of humans in the firelight, spinning, clapping, and laughing hard enough to shake the dust loose from the rafters. You don't dance, not yet, but you watch, and maybe, just maybe, your toe taps once under the table. Quirky tidbit for you: in some areas, dancing in alehouses was frowned upon by the local church, especially if it involved mixed genders, late hours, or songs about naughty nuns. But people danced anyway. Dancing was joy release rebellion. It was a way to forget sore backs, empty purses, and questionable stew. In some towns, an entire class of tavern dancers emerged, performers who were half acrobat, half flirt, and all spectacle. Now comes the storyteller. A broad man with a beard like braided rope and a voice deep enough to stir your drink. He stands no lute in hand, just his words. He begins a tale about a wandering merchant, a three-legged wolf, and a bag of gold that kept vanishing. The room quiets slowly as the rhythm of his words settles over them. You catch bits a treacherous bridge, a talking candle, a widow who knew too much. The story winds and loops, filled with suspense wit, and just enough moral ambiguity to make the ending feel earned. When he finishes, there's a pause and then a round of slow claps, mugs raised high in tribute. Historians still argue whether these tavern performances were spontaneous or staged, whether minstrels traveled in circuits or relied on local fame. In truth, it was likely both. Some performers were born with dusty boots and hungry bellies wandering from hearth to hearth. Others stayed put, becoming staples of the tavern like the bread or the smell. Your ale is topped up again, this time without asking. You sip slowly as the music changes, pace a softer tune now, more like a lullaby. The firelight flickers. Shadows sway with the dancers. The dog near your feet finally lies down with a sigh. And then, like magic, someone starts to sing in harmony. It begins with one voice, clear, hesitant. Then another joins. Then another. You realize it's a drinking song, probably centuries old even now, with a melody simple enough for a half-drunk Cooper to follow, and a chorus designed for shouting. You listen. You hum. You sing the next line. Badly. No one minds. Because tonight you're part of the show. The entertainment keeps rolling now. It's a man with a small puppet made from scraps of cloth and a boiled turnip. He makes it dance bow and mock the innkeeper's bald patch. The tavern roars. Even the innkeeper laughs. Probably because the man is too drunk to remember in the morning. The variety continues. A girl recites rude rhymes from a stool. Two men pretend to duel with sausages. Someone juggles turnips and drops every single one. And the tavern loves it. This isn't courtly entertainment. This is alehouse cabaret, raw and loud and deeply human. You think of how modern people pay fortunes for polished shows with light stages and scripts. But here in this dusty wooden room with smoke in your eyes and warmth in your chest, the laughter feels more real. The story's more immediate. The moment's more alive. The minstrel plucks one last chord and bows with dramatic flair. A coin is tossed, maybe two. The storyteller nods and returns to his corner. The dancers sit, sweat cooling on flushed faces, and just like that, the tavern exhales. You lean back, mug in hand, heart light. Because even if the stew was questionable and the dice were cursed, this was perfect. And as the final note fades and the candlelight shimmers like golden breath in the air, you realize something. The tavern is not just a place to drink. It's a place to remember you're still human. You're just about to rest your elbow on the table when the door swings open once more, letting in a puff of cold air, a swirl of smoke, and a figure you weren't expecting. A monk. Not the silent, hood-drawn, eyes-on-the-ground type from illuminated manuscripts. No, this one is grinning hood, thrown-back cheeks flushed from either wind or wine or both. His robes are travel-stained, his boots scandalously muddy. He slaps the innkeeper's arm like an old friend, mutters something that sounds suspiciously like a blessing, laced with profanity, and ducks toward the fire like he's done it 1,000 times. And maybe he has. Because yes, contrary to what you might assume, clergy drank. A lot. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. While the church officially frowned on drunkenness, many monks and priests were regular tavern-goers, especially those in towns far from the scrutiny of abbots or bishops. Records from across Europe mention fines issued to clergy for brawling in alehouses, singing bawdy songs, or even gambling away alms. You glance around to see how the other patrons respond. Some nod in greeting. One man offers the monk his seat. The minstrel, not missing a beat, changes his tune to something vaguely psalm-like but cheeky, and the monk laughs. He settles onto a stool, orders ale, not wine. Interestingly, and begins telling a story. Loudly. You don't catch the whole thing. Something about a goose, a cellar door, and an unfortunate misunderstanding involving fish oil, but it's a hit. His timing is impeccable. His theology? Questionable. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Monasteries brewed some of the best beer in the medieval world, and monks were often expert tasters, which, let's be honest, means they drank professionally. The rule of St. Benedict even included allowances for daily beer rations about a gallon per monk, depending on the abbey and the weather. Drink in moderation, it said. Though what counted as moderate in the 14th century is anyone's guess. The monk beside the hearth finishes his story to applause, then launches into a drinking song. This one's in Latin. It shouldn't be catchy, but it is. You hum along before realizing you're halfway through the chorus, and something about it sounds deeply heretical. Another fringe tidbit for you. Clerical drinking wasn't always frowned upon by the public. In fact, many villages liked having a local priest who could laugh, sing, and raise a mug. It made him feel more human, relatable, part of the community. Until, of course, he passed out in the duck pond, or accidentally married a couple twice. The monk turns, catches your eye, and raises his mug in a toast. To St. Bridget, he says. She turned bathwater into beer and made her nuns happy. You nod politely, sip your drink, and wonder if this is technically a sermon. You notice his belt pouch is heavy, possibly with coins, possibly with holy relics, possibly with cheese. You decide not to ask. Historians still argue whether tavern-going monks were exceptions, or whether the practice was widespread and quietly tolerated. One bishop's records from the 14th century list over 20 local clerics reprimanded for excessive tavern activity, including singing obscene ballads and throwing dice during Lent. Another monk was famously caught leading a conga line of donkeys through a French alehouse. True story, probably. A commotion near the bar distracts you. The monk is now debating theology with a man in a wool cap who appears to be losing badly. The subject, whether angels can get drunk. The monk's position, if they can sing, they can drink. The wool-capped man's response is mostly just hiccups. And yet, despite the laughter, you sense something deeper here. This isn't just a night off for the monk, it's a lifeline. Taverns were one of the few places where clergy and laity could interact informally. Where sermons became songs and confessions were traded for stew. Where a tired friar could rest his bones by the fire and speak freely without a bishop breathing down his neck, or a novice polishing his sandals. You notice he's listening now, not speaking. Nodding along as a young woman tells him about her sick mother, or a lost husband, or maybe a dream she had. He touches her shoulder, not inappropriately, but with genuine compassion. A blessing is muttered. Something is scribbled on parchment. You wonder how many quiet acts of mercy happened in smoky corners like this. The tavern grows quieter as the hour deepens. A few patrons have slumped in their seats. The music has slowed. The fire is lower. The monk remains alert, still smiling faintly, still sipping, but now humming to himself a tune that sounds almost familiar. You think it might be an old hymn repurposed into something sleepier, something softer. And then with surprising grace he stands. He thanks the innkeeper. He thanks the crowd. He crosses himself quickly, casually, and steps into the night cloak, billowing behind him like a shadow chased by the moon. No one speaks for a moment after he leaves, and then the noise resumes as if the spell is lifted. Another song begins. Another round is poured. The innkeeper shakes his head like he's seen it all before. Maybe he has. You lean back, eyes on the hearth, ears on the echoes of Latin still ringing through the rafters. Tonight the tavern was a church, and the sermon, well, it rhymed and had a chorus. It begins with the tankard tipping over. Not a dramatic smash, just a quiet thunk, followed by the slow, syrupy trickle of ale soaking into the already saturated floorboards. The man responsible doesn't notice. He's slumped forward, cheek pressed to the table, snoring softly with the kind of peace that only comes from utter oblivion. All around you, the tavern has shifted. It's subtler now, softer. The crowd has thinned. The fire is lower. Conversations taper into murmurs. Mugs are clutched more than clinked, and the laughter still present has taken on a slower rhythm. Fewer belly laughs, more tired chuckles. This is the danger hour when night drinks its deepest and alehouses turn from lively dens of revelry to something closer to dormant volcanoes still warm but threatening to erupt. Because as every medieval drinker knew, the brawls begin when the songs run out. You shift slightly on your stool, careful not to disturb the pile of bones chicken rat, unknown on the floor beside you. The smell of the place has become background now, a second skin. But you catch something new in the air tension, like a taut rope stretched too tight. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval tavern fights were common and sometimes deadly. Alehouses were among the most dangerous public spaces in a town, not because they housed criminals, but because they lowered the walls between classes, beliefs, and tempers. A merchant and a mason might drink together, joke together, until one spilled the other's drink or insulted a cousin's donkey, and then all bets were off. You hear it now, the shift. Two voices louder than they should be. A disagreement about coin or honor, or maybe just who owes whom a turnip. Chairs scrape, mugs rattle. The crowd's murmur lowers, turning toward the sound like a field of wheat bending in the wind. The innkeeper hasn't moved. Not yet. Instead, it's the alewife who steps forward first. One eyebrow raised so sharply it could slice cheese. Her presence alone calms the louder man momentarily. He mumbles something. She says nothing, just holds his gaze. But the other man stands. And now it begins, he shouts. A mug flies. It doesn't hit anyone, but it smashes dramatically enough to draw applause from the far table. Someone shouts, "That was my drink, though probably it wasn't." Chairs are pushed. Elbows are thrown. The bench tips over. The dog barks. A candle tumbles. The fire sputters. Welcome to the tavern brawl. Let's talk about medieval weapons of opportunity. You're surrounded by them. Wooden mugs, iron fire pokers, soup ladles, benches, crusty loaves of bread so stale they might as well be hammers. You watch as one man brandishes a spoon like a dagger. Another holds a stool over his head, threatening someone. It's unclear. Now, for a fringe tidbit, some medieval towns pass specific laws banning stools from taverns after dark, not for lack of furniture, but because too many people use them as weapons. You can see why. The man with the stool is now chasing the spoon wielder in slow, staggering loops around the fire. They look like angry ducks. The innkeeper moves now, slow, deliberate, with the same gravity as a cathedral bell. He says one word. Just one. The brawlers freeze caught mid-step. Someone coughs. A tankard rolls. And just like that, the air uncoils. The tension breaks. The spoon is dropped. The stool is returned. The innkeeper returns to his perch without further comment. It's a performance, one you suspect happens nightly, but not all fights end in furniture duels. Some leave blood. You notice the man near the bar cradling his hand, a thin ribbon of red, glinting in the firelight. A woman appears with a rag, presses it gently to his skin. He flinches. She murmurs something, probably not comforting, but it works. Quirky tidbit alewives often doubled as first aid stations, treating cuts, bruises, and the occasional bitten ear. Some even kept herbal salves under the counter mixtures of honey thyme vinegar and pig fat to soothe wounds and ward off infection. Did it work? Sometimes, mostly, enough. Historians still argue whether these tavern fights reflected deeper social unrest, class tension, religious division, or just too much barley mash. But many agree that alehouses acted as release valves. Better to throw a punch over spilled ale than over a tax collector's decree. At least here the bruise is healed, usually. A man nearby is trying to stand swaying like a sapling in a gale. His friend grabs his tunic, pulls him back down, hands him a mug of water, or possibly weak beer. You notice this too. Tavern friends are strange, blurry bonds. They fight, then toast. They curse, then share bread. And in the morning they remember only the parts they want to. Now you hear laughter again, a little forced, a little raw, but real. The moment has passed, the brawl is over. The alewife tosses the bloodied rag into the fire, wipes her hands on her apron, and continues pouring drinks like nothing happened. You glance down and notice that at some point, perhaps during the stool chase, someone took your seat. You're now standing leaning on the table, mug in hand, sore-legged but still awake. A few patrons are sleeping now, heads on arms, breath slow and steady. The dog is curled beside the fire, one ear twitching at every sound. The innkeeper is watching everything. The alewife is refilling cups with the precision of a surgeon, the man who started the fight. He's outside now cooling his temper, or emptying his stomach. Possibly both. And you're still here. A little buzzed, a little wary, a little wiser. Because you've learned the golden rule of medieval taverns. Drink slowly, sit wisely, and never underestimate a man holding a loaf of bread. You wake with a start. Well, more of a twitch, really. You weren't quite asleep, just hovering in that strange place where time becomes soup, and your thoughts feel gently soaked in ale. Around you, the tavern breathes a little slower, as though it too is nursing a headache that hasn't fully bloomed yet. And that's when it hits you. The hangover is coming. Maybe not for you, you paced yourself. Maybe. But for half the room, it's already begun. You can see it in the way people sit now, slumped forward, heads in hands, blinking slowly like owls in a thunderstorm. One man keeps rubbing the bridge of his nose like it owes him rent. Another sips weak ale with the fearful reverence of someone who's seen battle. Welcome to the next medieval rite of passage surviving the aftermath. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. Hangovers were well known and well feared in the Middle Ages, though no one called them that. The phrase morning after carried weight because what you drank last night wasn't filtered, pasteurized, or even guaranteed to be entirely ale. And if you overindulge in the kind of taverns that cut costs by mixing in strange herbs, rotting grain, or reused casks, well, your head would tell you about it, loudly. Now you notice the signs. A woman near the hearth is trying to soothe her temples with the strip of damp cloth. A man in the corner mutters to himself between sips of stale water. Someone groans softly and lies back down on a bundle of straw like a wounded knight. You ask yourself, what would a medieval person do about this? Let's dig into the remedies. Quirky tidbit: one popular hangover cure was pickled eel brine, essentially. Eel bits soaked in vinegar and salt water swallowed with grim determination. Supposedly it settled the humors, though it likely just caused your stomach to forget what it was mad about. Another cure: roasted goat lungs sliced thin and sprinkled with mint. That was considered a delicacy and a remedy depending on who you asked and whether the goat had recently died of natural causes. Monks swore by fennel tea. Sailors preferred vinegar mixed with warm ale. And one brave soul recommended wearing a hat stuffed with damp moss to pull the heat out of the skull. Historians still argue whether these cures worked or were just elaborate ways of punishing the body further. But hey, desperation breeds creativity. Meanwhile, someone else is cooking something by the hearth onions, sizzling slowly in a pan seasoned with salt, garlic, and possibly regret. The scent stirs something in your belly. It smells like healing, or at least like distraction. You shift to your feet and move closer. The woman stirring the pan gives you a sidelong glance, then gestures one coin. You give it. The resulting stew is oily, slightly burnt, and exactly what you needed. Fringe tidbit in some towns, special morning after meals were sold outside taverns like a pop-up medieval brunch. These might include cold beans, leftover meat pies, or broth steeped with parsley. One London alley was known for its drinker's bread, a thick, sour loaf believed to anchor the mind. Someone now is pacing the room with deliberate steps, holding a sprig of lavender beneath his nose. You overhear him explaining that it wards off drink demons. Another man crushes cloves between his teeth, muttering about keeping his tongue from falling out. The logic is questionable, the dedication is not. A few patrons have clearly decided that the only cure is more ale. This is called the hair of the dog approach. And yes, it existed then too. The term comes from an even older remedy. If a dog bit, you rub the same dog's hair on the wound. Apply that to hangovers and you've got a drinker's logic that says, what hurt me can also help me. You watch as a man grimaces his way through a morning mug, and you're unsure if it's courage or madness. The alewife walks past with a tray of mugs, some filled with water, others with a pale, foamy liquid she calls small ale. It's weaker than last night's brew intended for rehydration, not recreation. You accept one. It tastes like sour bread tears, but it helps. Outside, you hear the world waking. A rooster crows. A cart rattles by. The sky through the warped window is a dull gray, the kind that feels hungover too. Someone pulls open the shutters just enough to let in a bit of light, which is met with groans and curses. The man beside you mutters something about never drinking again. The universal lie passed down through centuries of bleary mornings. The woman across from him swats him with a crust of bread and hands him a bowl of broth. You wonder what about medieval beliefs? Surely there were spiritual hangover explanations. Indeed. Some preachers claimed overindulgence allowed evil spirits to swim in your thoughts. Others warned that drunkenness weakened the soul's armor, letting demons nest in the belly. The solution, confession, or fasting, or a very cold bath followed by 3 laps around the church barefoot. You glance down at your boots, you'll pass. But others clearly take this more seriously. A monk is back, maybe the same one from last night, maybe not offering blessings in exchange for donations to the poor. One drunk sobs, donates his only coin. Another falls asleep mid-prayer. Someone throws up behind a barrel. No one reacts. The tavern begins to shift again. Benches are scrubbed loosely. Mugs are collected. The hearth is stoked. A new batch of bread is brought out, still steaming. The innkeeper appears from somewhere looking none the worse for wear and begins calculating last night's tab. You catch a whiff of rosemary, maybe from the stew, maybe from someone's desperate cure. And despite everything, despite the pounding heads, the rumbling bellies, the soiled straw bedding, and the terrifying goat lung soup, you find it oddly beautiful. Because here's the thing, a medieval tavern hangover wasn't just personal, it was communal. Everyone hurt together. Everyone helped each other through. A stranger's hand might bring you a cup. A neighbor might share their herbs. Even the alewife might, if she liked your face, slide a free crust your way. You sit quietly with your cup, feeling the last remnants of sleep lift from your shoulders. You've made it through the night and the morning, and your stomach hasn't revolted yet. Raise your mug of water this time and toast the most powerful ancient force in tavern history: survival. The tavern is waking fully now, not just in the sleepy shuffle sense, but in the clang of mugs, the scraping of stools, and the quiet curse of someone realizing they have lost a shoe. Or perhaps both, but something else is stirring too. Not in the cups or the hearth, but behind the scenes in the ledger's barrels and whispered complaints the money talk. Because where there's ale, there are taxes. And where there are taxes, there's grumbling. Let's pour ourselves a flagon of brewing regulations and scandal, shall we? Mainstream historical fact. By the late 13th century, English towns began rigorously taxing ale production, with officials called ale-tasters or ale-conners employed to inspect brews and enforce quality. These weren't casual checks. An understrength ale or one sold without license could land you with a fine, a public shaming or worse, a reputation for weak drink. You hear the alewife now near the back discussing this week's inspection with the innkeeper. Her voice is low tight. He says the mash was too thin, she mutters, but he came back for thirds. That's the crux of the matter. Regulation meets exploitation, and often the officials enforcing ale laws were deep in the mug themselves. Quirky tidbit: some ale inspectors accepted bribes in beer. Literally. They'd test the ale multiple times sometimes, 3, 4, 5 mugfuls deep, then declare it passable so long as their own tankard remained full. It's why taste testing became a euphemism for drinking on someone else's coin. You may recognize this practice from modern office birthday parties. You shift your seat closer, pretending to examine your now cold stew while eavesdropping. The alewife mutters about changing grain suppliers. The malt's not right, she says. Too pale. And those scoundrels at the mill cheat the weight. The innkeeper grunts in agreement. This is more than idle griping. Medieval brewing was a delicate business part, science part, magic part, guesswork. You needed decent water, not always available, well-dried malt, clean barrels, and the patience to let fermentation do its thing without it turning into vinegar or soup. And then once the brew was good, the officials came calling. Let's talk about the assize of bread and ale, a delightful bit of 13th century bureaucracy that set fixed prices for baked goods and drinks depending on grain prices. If grain went up, ale strength could legally go down. If a brewer got too generous, they could be punished for overcharging or spoiling the market. Yes, that's right. You could get fined for being too good at your job. You glance at your mug. It's fine. Not too strong, not too weak. Likely measured and watered just right to pass inspection. A man by the bar is now telling a tale of a brewer's cart being seized by the local reeve. Said it was underweight, he scoffs. I say he wanted it for his niece's wedding. This earns a few nods, and one muttered, Reeves are all thieves. Fringe tidbit: in Norwich and other English towns, public brewers had their own symbols stamped into the foam with small wooden paddles. These marked who had made the ale and whether it had passed inspection. Counterfeiting these paddles was illegal and profitable. One brewer was found guilty of falsifying the froth and had to walk barefoot through town with a fake barrel strapped to his back. A bit much, really. You notice the tavern's own symbol, now a simple ox head carved into a wooden board hanging above the hearth. Likely the brewer's mark. Subtle. But enough for those who know how to look. And this tavern doesn't just brew. It sells, and that means navigating guilds, taxes, and the occasional crooked official who insists on tasting every barrel before declaring it safe for pilgrims. Someone near you snorts. Saw a Connor last week, too drunk to walk. Said my wife's vinegar was full-bodied. General laughter follows, but it's tinged with bitterness. Because the thing is, everyone drinks, but only some profit. The alewife carries the labor. The innkeeper takes the risk, And the officials, they skim the foam, as it were. Now comes the real scandal. Two women at the far table are whispering. One leans in voice low, she boiled it twice. Then added root scrap. Swore it would keep longer. Her companion gasps. But the taxman didn't notice the first woman grins, too busy staring at her daughter. It clicks for you now. Beneath the bread, the benches, the stew, and the songs, this tavern runs on cunning. Brewing is an art of survival and subterfuge, of balancing flavor with profit, honesty with necessity. Too strong and you draw attention. Too weak and you lose customers. Too pure and you go broke. Historians still argue whether these brewing scandals reflect criminality or ingenuity. Some say illegal brewing was theft from the community. Others say it was simply a woman keeping her family alive in a world that taxed her every pot. The innkeeper passes by your table. He sets down a fresh mug without asking. Don't tell the Connor, he says with a wink. You take a sip. It's better than before. Smoother, deeper, slightly spiced. Definitely not the standard batch. This is the good stuff, hidden until the right time. Until the right people are present. Until the inspectors are gone and the sun is still low. A special brew for those who know how to ask without asking. You raise your mug in silent thanks. The innkeeper is already gone. In this alehouse, the real rules aren't written. They're whispered. Passed from brewer to brewer, from bench to bench. Protected by the clink of mugs and the squeak of stools. So drink deeply, and if someone asks, it's just barley water. Honest. The tavern door creaks open again, not with the careless bluster of last night's revelers, but with something quieter. Intentional. A figure enters, cloaked, hood drawn low. No mud on the boots, no loud greetings, no "Ale ordered." You recognize the type even without the theatrics, a whisperer. Every tavern has one. The stranger moves not to the bar, but to the far table in the corner. The same one where last night's dice game ended with an overturned stool and someone's dignity in a puddle. The bench there has been righted. A candle burns low. Two other figures are already seated. They don't talk. Not right away. But soon they're leaning in, voices, low heads together, mugs untouched. The entire tavern pretends not to notice. Which, of course, means everyone notices. Because tonight this tavern isn't just for stew and songs. Tonight it's a political powder keg. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. Medieval taverns were hotbeds of subversive chatter places where the discontented could speak freely, or at least more freely than in the market square. Monarchs, mayors, and magistrates all feared the alehouse for one key reason. It let people talk in groups, usually with enough ale to forget their fear, but not enough to forget their grievances. The men in the corner whisper a little louder now. You catch a few phrases. Too many levies. Bishop's guards. Wednesday night by the south wall. You look down at your mug. Suddenly it feels heavier. Here's a quirky tidbit. Many revolts in medieval England were born in alehouses. The 1381 Peasants' Revolt, fueled not just by taxes but by talk. Angry talk. Strategic talk. The kind that builds in the backs of taverns, fueled by sour beer and staler bread. John Ball, the rebel priest, preached sermons in inns disguised as casual chats. Wat Tyler, the revolt's figurehead, allegedly recruited supporters between rounds. And what better place the tavern is, loud, crowded, anonymous. Who remembers a face glimpsed through smoke and firelight? Who recalls which hand passed which coin to which man? You glance again at the corner. Now there are 5 men at the table. One leans back, arms crossed, gaze sweeping the room. You look away before your eyes meet. The innkeeper hasn't moved, nor has the alewife. But both have at some point shifted their positions just enough to watch the table from opposite angles. This is no accident. Fringe tidbits: some innkeepers were informants paid by local lords or church officials to report suspicious gatherings. Others were double agents playing both sides, feeding scraps of information to one master while shielding rebels from another. In certain cities, innkeepers were required by law to report political conversations. But that didn't always stop them from listening or from choosing what to forget. You sip your drink more slowly now. Behind you, another table starts singing, loudly, off key. The distraction is obvious, intentional. Someone's trying to mask the whispers. You feel it, the tension, the thrum of possibility. You think about what a rebellion would feel like from the inside. It wouldn't be knights in armor or banners flapping in wind. It would be this a drafty room-stale ale secret meetings and the quiet certainty that something is breaking. One of the men at the corner table stands, adjusts his cloak, and walks to the bar. You tense, but he simply drops a coin, says something to the alewife, and leaves. The others follow soon after single file, no eye contact, no words. Just a gust of wind, the slam of the door, and the tavern exhales. The singing fades. The minstrel starts tuning again. Someone groans and demands soup. The tension dissolves like foam on beer, and yet it lingers. Historians still argue whether taverns caused uprisings or merely reflected them. Whether the ideas brewed inside these walls changed history, or simply gave people a safe place to say what they were already thinking. But one thing certain, the tavern was the printing press before the printing press. Ideas passed in mugs and murmurs. The people at the bottom of the ladder finally heard each other speak and found they were not alone. You glance toward the fire and notice a scrap of parchment someone left behind. Probably nothing, or maybe a list of names. You leave it alone. You finish your ale. The innkeeper gives you a look that might mean nothing, or everything. Later that night, or perhaps early morning, it's hard to tell, you notice a new arrival at the tavern. Not a local, and certainly not a monk this time. His cloak is finer stitched with foreign patterns. His boots are clean. And his expression carries that universal mark of the seasoned traveler, deep weariness laced with curiosity. He steps inside, takes one sweeping glance around the room, and smiles faintly. You can feel it even before he orders he isn't from here. And just like that, your sleepy little alehouse becomes part of something much larger. A crossroads of cultures. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval taverns were international hubs, especially in port towns, cathedral cities, and along major trade routes. Despite the image of cloistered villages and insular peasants, the Middle Ages were surprisingly mobile. Pilgrims, merchants, mercenaries, scholars, all drifted through alehouses carrying not just coin but languages, flavors, and ideas. The traveler tonight orders wine, not ale, which earns him a few sideways glances. Not angry ones, just amused. Here, wine is considered either fancy or foreign, or both. He doesn't seem to mind. He sits, alone for now, unbuckles a small satchel, unfolds a parchment, orders stew. Then he sneezes. And just like that, conversation resumes. The tavern accepts him. Now, for a quirky tidbit, different cultures had wildly different drinking customs, and taverns were the testing grounds. Germans often stood while drinking, slamming mugs and rhythmic toasts. Italians preferred diluted wine and raised eyebrows at cloudy ale. Scandinavians drank from shared horns. French pilgrims carried their own wooden cups. And the English, well, they judged everyone. You glance at the traveler's parchment. It's a map, or something like it. Lines drawn over smudged names. You're too far to see clearly, but it doesn't look local. A woman brings him stew, and he bows his head in thanks, not with words, but with both hands pressed together. A gesture from far away. It gets you thinking. What did this man expect when he stepped into a tavern in your part of the world? Probably not the burnt onions, or the snoring shepherd, or the dog currently chewing on something ominous beneath the bench. But he stays. And that's the thing about taverns as global spaces. Despite the smells, the chaos, and the occasionally violent spoons, they were often welcoming by default. No one cared if you were from Bruges or Baghdad, so long as you played fair and didn't insult the alewife. Fringe tidbit diplomatic meetings sometimes happened in inns disguised as casual meals. A Flemish envoy in the 14th century claimed his treaty with the Scottish merchant began over broth and barley, and that only after the fourth cup did we mention the crown. You see the traveler now chatting with a local. Language isn't the same, but they find ways gestures names laughter. Someone offers him dice. He declines. Someone else points at his boots. He raises an eyebrow, more laughter. Soon the line between guest and regular begins to blur. And that's the secret of the tavern. It doesn't belong to the village. It belongs to whoever shows up. You've seen it all now, local quarrels. Monks with questionable sermons, politics disguised as stew, and travelers mapping the world one sip at a time. Each person brings something new, and sometimes they take something with them. The traveler tucks a folded page into his bag. You glimpse the edge of it, script you can't read, ink still wet. He'll carry it to the next inn and the next town where he'll share stories of this one. Perhaps he'll speak of the innkeeper's stare or the stew that hinted at garlic. Maybe he'll hum the tune the minstrel played just before nodding off mid-verse. Or maybe he'll say nothing, because sometimes a place leaves its mark in quieter ways. Historians still argue whether medieval taverns were melting pots or pressure cookers, whether they blended culture or boiled it down. But one thing is clear, they were windows. You didn't have to leave your village to hear Latin smell saffron or taste pepper. You just had to show up and listen. The traveler finishes his meal. Leaves a coin, silver, not copper. The alewife raises her eyebrows but pockets it without fuss. He thanks her in 2 languages, then steps out into the fog. And maybe, just maybe, he'll remember you too. That silent figure by the hearth, wrapped in smoke and story. You who saw it all. A hush falls over the room, but not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind. The kind that arrives when something is about to happen and nobody wants to admit they know what. The dog near the fire lifts its head. You glance toward the back of the tavern where a curtain hangs crookedly across a low doorway. It shifts slightly, just enough to reveal a sliver of shadowed space beyond. The back room. You hadn't really noticed it before. Or maybe you did, but ignored it like the locals seem to do. It's a space rarely entered, rarely spoken of. And when it is, it's with a shrug and a best not to ask. Tonight, though, someone asks. A young man in a green hood leans toward the innkeeper. They exchange a few words too quiet to hear, and the innkeeper nods once. Just once. No drama. But then he moves toward the curtain, lifts it, and disappears into the gloom. The green-hooded man follows. No one reacts. Not really. A few eyes flick up, then away. A woman mutters something and crosses herself. The minstrel plucks a single discordant note on his lute. The moment passes. But you're curious now. Because every tavern, no matter how humble, has a space beyond the firelight. And it's usually where the real stories live. Let's explore. Mainstream historical fact. Many medieval taverns had back rooms, sometimes for storage, sometimes for cooking, sometimes for less official purposes. Gambling political meetings, quiet negotiations, and the occasional black market transaction all took place just out of view from the common floor. Inns on pilgrimage routes often rented these side rooms to those who wanted company, not stew. You peer at the curtain again. It doesn't move. But now your mind is turning. The back room could be anything. Everything. And it's not just about what goes on there, it's about what people believe goes on. That's where the tension simmers. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some towns, back rooms were where broadsheets were copied and spread handwritten jokes, or slanderous ballads about the mayor, or the bishop, or the miller's 5th wife. Often crude, occasionally treasonous, never boring. You once overheard someone call the back room St. Radigan's Chapel. No one laughed. Maybe there's a real St. Radigan. Maybe it's a joke about someone who never came out. You spot a serving girl approaching the curtain, now tray in hand. She disappears behind it. Doesn't reemerge for quite some time. When she does, her tray is lighter, her face unreadable. The atmosphere shifts again. This is tavern duality. What you see songs, mugs, stew is only half of it. The rest happens in whispers behind curtain with gestures and passwords and quiet favors. Let's not be naive. Some backrooms were brothels barely disguised. Even in small villages, it wasn't uncommon for alehouses to rent rooms by the hour, especially when marriages were arranged more by landowners than love. In cities, whole tavern districts blurred the line between inn and house of pleasure. Fringe tidbit. There are surviving 14th century manuals for tavern-based tris-coded language price structures, even recommended times of day for avoiding church patrols. One recommends dawn when the watchman doze and the baker is loudest. Still, not every back room was scandalous. Some were sanctuaries, places for secret healing, hidden prayer, even quiet reading. In some towns, Jewish travelers or dissenting Christians used back rooms to gather in safety. In others, runaway serfs signed letters promising loyalty to new lords. And in a few rare cases, back rooms were libraries of sorts. A merchant's son might copy a poem there. A monk might stash a forbidden text. A traveling scholar might leave behind a riddle in Latin, scratched into the underside of the table. Historians still argue whether these spaces were essential to tavern life, or just side effects of poor architecture. But every serious chronicler agrees on this. What happened behind the curtain could change everything in front of it. You wonder what's happening back there now. An agreement, a betrayal, a story too private for public air, or maybe just two people drinking in silence away from the noise. The curtain shifts. The man in the green hood steps out again. His expression is blank. Not troubled, not pleased, just finished. He adjusts his hood and leaves. The innkeeper reappears, returns behind the bar, and wipes down a mug that's already clean. His movements are calm, familiar. No one says a word. You take another sip of your drink. It's warmer now, or maybe you are. You realize that the front room is for forgetting, for the noise and the chaos, the distraction. But the back room is for remembering, for decisions, secrets, truths. And the curtain, it keeps the peace. You've seen enough for tonight. You lean back on your stool, your gaze still drifting to the low doorway from time to time. It's just fabric. It moves with the draft. But tonight it feels like a veil between worlds. And behind it, only what you're willing to know. The mood has shifted again. You notice it in the quiet clatter of a spoon against a wooden bowl, in the slow drag of a broom across the floor, in the way the light now spills more silver than gold through the warped shutters. Dawn is stirring, but before it fully arrives, there's still time for a few last guesses. The door opens once more, not slowly or theatrically, but with that precise, purposeful motion that belongs to someone used to watching the room before they enter it. 3 of them, dressed simply but not plainly. One carries a walking staff. Another wears a pouch shaped suspiciously like a flask. The third scans the room without smiling. Foreigners, yes, but not travelers. Inspectors, not the tax kind, not even the ale-tasting kind. These are harder to place educated eyes, perhaps church-affiliated, perhaps secular. Their presence spreads across the room like spilled candle wax. They walk straight to a table, do not order. The innkeeper appears before they can speak. You don't hear what's said, but you see the nods, the scribbled notes, the way the alewife stands a little straighter as they pass. This is something different, because while the back room may be a world of secrets, this is about control. Let's talk about medieval regulation, and not the fun kind involving barley strength and broken stools. Mainstream historical fact taverns were regularly investigated for moral conduct, especially during times of social unrest or plague. Authorities, both civic and religious, feared the alehouse as a place where boundaries blurred between class, between sexes, between God and gut. And whenever things got too noisy, too scandalous, or too revolutionary, a crackdown was sure to follow. These men are here for precisely that, to ask questions, to check the ledger, to observe quietly and with full authority whether the alehouse has crossed a line. And lines in medieval terms were invisible and constantly moving. Quirky tidbit in 15th century York. A tavern was fined because a woman danced barefoot on a barrel while singing the names of all the local Reeves pigs. The official charge was mockery. The real issue, laughter in the wrong direction. The inspectors pull out a small scroll. One reads aloud softly, but not privately. You can't catch the words, but you hear enough to guess something about order, something about unauthorized games, and something about curfew. Ah yes, the tavern curfew laws. You may not know this, but many towns, especially post-plague, enacted strict regulations around tavern hours. Last call wasn't just a social cue, it was law. Bells rang at sunset in many villages to signal the shutting up of alehouses. Staying open later required special permission or special friends. Fringe tidbit in Norwich nighttime ale selling was once declared a cause of noises, fights, and fornications, which sounds like a medieval nightclub review. The punishment. Not just fines, but occasionally forced closures, public apologies, or even flogging in front of the tavern itself. The innkeeper's voice remained steady, respectful. The alewife listens, arms crossed, jaw tight. You know she's calculating. Not just the cost of the fine if one comes, but the reputational damage. Because that's the real currency here. The inspectors don't drink. They don't stay long. But they leave behind a silence heavier than their presence. As they exit, one pauses to glance back. His eyes flick across the room, linger briefly on the minstrel's instrument, then on the curtained back room. And then they're gone. Just like that. No one cheers. No one jokes. The fire pops quietly. It will be a few minutes before the tavern breathes again. Historians still argue whether inspectors helped maintain tavern standards or simply enforced the biases of the elite. Many suggest both. In places where alehouses served as the only communal space, these visits could damage livelihoods or stoke simmering anger into revolution. But the tavern survives. Because it must. You watch the innkeeper move, now cleaning with more care than before. The alewife mutters something half irritated, half pragmatic. The boy near the back wipes down benches that have been sticky since the previous century. It's a ritual of reassurance. And as the light brightens, the tavern changes too. The mischief sleeps, the mystery recedes. And what remains are tables and chairs, bread and ash, a place to rest. But you'll remember that look, that glance toward the back room. You wonder how many places were closed after such a glance. How many stories ended when a scroll unrolled and a law was enforced? How many songs went unsung? How many tankards went undrunk? The innkeeper lets out a long, slow breath. The alewife cracks her knuckles. The dog rolls over. And you're still here. Still watching. Still wondering where the lines are and who draws them. Because in a medieval tavern, survival isn't just about brewing or brawling or singing loudest. It's about knowing when to open the door and when to close the curtain. A rooster crows in the distance and someone groans as if personally offended by the sunrise. The tavern is starting to stir again, this time in that peculiar liminal hour when the drunkards haven't left, and the day folk begin trickling in. You notice it immediately in the change of footwear, muddy boots and patched shoes replaced by sandals and work clogs, trailing in the scent of cold dew and bakery ash. It's a shift change not just of people but of purpose. Because as the night retreats, the tavern doesn't close. It transforms. And with it comes a different kind of chatter, louder, faster, more transactional. Gone are the slow-spoken riddles and whispered schemes. In their place are phrases like 3 sacks of barley he didn't pay last week and how fresh is it really? The tavern, you realize, isn't just a drinking hole. It's a marketplace. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. In many medieval towns, taverns operated as informal trading posts, especially in the early hours. Farmers, craftsmen, messengers, and minor merchants used alehouses to strike deals, pay debts, and swap news. Before formal stalls opened in the town square, deals were already sealed over mugs of weak morning ale and fistfuls of grain. You see it now. A man with a cartload of salted herring pulls up outside. Two others emerge from the alley, one carrying sheared wool, the other with a basket of cracked eggs. Inside, a woman counts out coins onto the table carefully, publicly, before receiving a folded scrap of parchment from the alewife. An IOU, a recipe, a list of names. You don't ask, because this is where commerce lives without ceremony. No scales, no banners, no guild badges, just hands, glances, and quiet trust. Quirky tidbit: in parts of Italy and southern France, taverns doubled as informal post offices where travelers left letters tucked behind barrels or scratched messages into beams. One recorded tavern in Avignon had a message wall where notes were pinned with chicken bones. Closer to your fire, a group of men are measuring out grain by handfuls, muttering about weight and price. One accuses the other of dampening the barley. The second shrugs unbothered and offers a sniff. A third offers to taste it. A fourth bets a mug that none of them can tell the difference. Business, you now see, is rarely solemn here, but it is binding. Fringe tidbits: some medieval taverns served as legal venues where minor disputes were settled on the spot. A spilled ale, a broken wheel, a lost goat if all parties were present, and the alewife willing to mediate a decision could be reached. Often with witnesses who'd later forget everything except the result. You notice someone writing now. Not the usual scratch of a drunk scribe trying to remember a song lyric, but ledgers. The innkeeper has a thick, grimy book. He flips it open with the care of someone handling a newborn piglet and begins recording debts and deliveries with a chunk of charcoal. One man gestures toward a missing entry. The innkeeper frowns. They argue. A coin changes hands. The entry is made. They shake on it. It's over. The tavern, you realize, remembers more than people think. Even the dog seems aware of the difference. It has moved from its ash-padded hearth to the doorway, watching each new arrival with narrowed eyes. If it barks, the guest pauses. If it doesn't, they proceed. The alewife is already heating the day's first real meal. This one's different: eggs, onions, crusts fried in lard, all stirred into a thick morning gruel. It smells like responsibility. Like the kind of breakfast that expects you to do something afterward. She serves without speaking. Everyone here knows the price. Someone lifts a mug and mutters, "May your trade be fair and your scales not cursed." The others nod, a blessing of sorts. You hear the clink of coins again, and something else gossip now dressed as news. The merchant's boy didn't come back from Farrington. The bishop's seal changed last week. 4 carts passed without stopping. That's not normal. Historians still argue whether these alehouse transactions were central to the medieval economy or merely auxiliary. But from where you sit, it's obvious this is where the real economy breathes. Not on parchment, not in castle halls, but here where bread crusts are traded for wool tufts and a handshake can move a whole barrel of apples. A man near you turns and asks without preamble, "Know anyone who sells roofing nails without rust?" You shake your head. He grunts and moves on. The question is already gone. Now there's talk of tools, repairs, shipping schedules. A chalk mark appears on a table leg, denoting a promised sack of oats. A carved spoon is placed beside it to mark the claim. Ancient escrow. You look around and realize something else. Every person here is working, even if they're only watching. Because watching means learning, listening, planning the next trade, and you you're still just observing. But now you're a part of the system. Your mug, your warmth, your silence, they all play a role. Because this tavern isn't a place you pass through. It's a place that records you. By midday, the tables will clear. By dusk, the laughter will return. But right now, the work gets done. And the ale, still warm, still honest, still worth trading for. The day trudges on outside, but inside the tavern begins to hush the lively market chatter, fading to a quieter hum. The fire's light softens and the shadows stretch longer across the soot-streaked walls. It's the threshold between day and night when the tavern transforms once again. The daytime traders trickle out, replaced by a new tide travelers' entertainers and those with no fixed home. You watch as a tall, lean man steps through the door, cloak damp from the road, and eyes sharp with fatigue and purpose. He pauses, surveys the room, then makes his way to the bar. This is a man on a mission. He orders a tankard of ale and leans close to the innkeeper, speaking in hushed tones. The innkeeper nods, eyes flicking toward the back room before returning to his new customer. You can tell immediately this man is not here for stew or song. He is here to negotiate. Mainstream historical fact, many medieval taverns served as informal meeting places for merchants, diplomats, and sometimes spies. Agreements about trade routes, alliances, and secret dealings were often forged in back rooms and shadowed corners. Taverns were the crossroads of commerce and conspiracy. The lean man scans the faces of the tavern patrons, with a calculated gaze, no doubt assessing who might overhear too much or who might be useful as an ally. He pulls from his cloak a small folded parchment, unfolding it with careful fingers. You catch a glimpse of a rough map dotted with symbols you don't recognize. Quirky tidbit: in some towns, traveling merchants carried coded parchments or merchants' marks to communicate routes, contacts, or dangers without writing openly. These codes could be simple symbols or complex cipher systems passed from hand to hand in the dim corners of alehouses. The man unfolds the map again and begins speaking quietly with the innkeeper. Their voices are low, filled with urgency and secrecy. Nearby, a minstrel begins a soft tune on a lute, carefully timed to mask their words. You realize this is not mere chance. This is a practiced dance. Behind the innkeeper, the alewife watches, silent but alert. You get the sense she knows every corner of this dance, every step of every negotiation. Fringe tidbits: some taverns were known to house couriers who secretly delivered messages between kingdoms or factions, their true business hidden beneath the clatter of mugs and laughter. One story tells of a courier disguised as a traveling minstrel who carried a letter sewn into his lute case. You watch as a shadowy figure slips into the back room, disappearing behind the familiar curtain. The lean man finishes his drink, folds the parchment with a practiced motion, and leaves a heavy coin on the counter. He nods once to the innkeeper and disappears into the night. The fire flickers, the song grows louder. The tavern exhales and returns to its rhythm. And yet beneath the noise, beneath the laughter and clatter, the pulse of hidden deals beats steady and strong. You sip your ale slowly, savoring the warmth. This place, this chaotic, smoky, uneven space, is alive with stories. Open and closed, spoken and silent. It is a crossroads, a stage, a vault, and you have seen just a fraction. Historians still argue whether these clandestine meetings shaped history or simply followed its course. But for now, here in this smoky tavern, it doesn't matter. Because tonight you have been a part of the story, and the story continues. As the evening deepens, the crowd thickens once more. The fire roars a little brighter, the smoke curls heavier, and the air fills with that unmistakable blend of laughter, shouting, and clinking mugs, the sounds of a tavern alive with possibility. But tonight, something else threads through the noise stories of the night's lesser-known indulgences, whispered carefully and shared among those who know how to listen. Because in this tavern, the line between alehouse and brothel is often as thin as the wooden partitions dividing the common room from the back chambers. Let's be clear, this isn't a dive into scandal or salacious detail. It's history, the blurred, messy kind where morality and necessity overlap, and where survival often demanded flexibility. Mainstream historical fact: many medieval taverns did indeed offer lodging and companionship, often unadvertised to travelers and locals alike. Licensing laws varied, and some alehouses openly housed sex workers. Others operated under quiet understanding. These arrangements ranged from informal agreements with alewives to outright brothel management disguised as tavern keeping. You watch as a woman in a brightly colored dress, laughter bright and easy, moves through the crowd. She's greeted with nods and small gifts, a marked contrast to the wary glances some younger women receive. There's an unspoken hierarchy of respect and danger here between those who work these spaces and those who merely pass through. Quirky tidbit: in some English towns, sex workers paid a bawd tax to local authorities, a crude recognition of their presence and contribution to the economy. Failure to pay could result in fines, imprisonment, or worse. In certain places, alehouses with brothel licenses were expected to provide order within their walls, balancing indulgence with discipline. Behind the curtained back room, muffled laughter and whispered deals continue. A man exits quietly, hood drawn, low coin purse lighter. Another enters, nods at the innkeeper, and disappears behind the curtain. Fringe tidbit: some tavern brothels doubled as information hubs, where secrets were traded as currency. Patrons and workers alike could share rumors, political tidbits, or news of rival factions. A whispered word in the right ear could change fortunes, even kingdoms. The innkeeper watches all this with a practiced eye. His gruff exterior belies an acute awareness of the balance needed to keep his establishment running: pleasure and order, profit and protection. You notice the alewife watching too. Her hands steady on a tankard, her gaze sharp. She is the silent guardian of these thresholds, ensuring the peace holds. You sip your ale, feeling the warmth flood your chest, steadying your thoughts. The night grows heavy. The dog curls closer to the hearth, and the tavern in all its complexity breathes as one. Historians still argue how deeply intertwined taverns and brothels were, whether they were always separate or simply two sides of the same coin. What's clear is that these spaces were vital to medieval social life, offering refuge, pleasure, and power in equal measure. You lean back, the weight of centuries settling around you. Tonight you have glimpsed a world of laughter and longing, light and shadow. A world where stories are spun not just with words, but with every glance and gesture. And as the candle flickers low, you realize the tavern is more than a place. It is a living, breathing story, and you are part of its endless tale. The fire burns low now, casting long, flickering shadows that stretch and yawn across the worn floorboards. The tavern, once a riotous symphony of noise, has quieted into something softer, a gentle murmur punctuated by the occasional cough or the scrape of a chair. You realize it's the final stretch, the last toast before dawn. The hour when mugs are drained, voices soften, and the world outside waits patiently for the sun's first light. Around you, the remaining patrons clutch their tankards like lifelines. Some sit in thoughtful silence. Others whisper plans for the next day or the next night. The minstrel's lute hums a slow, soothing tune. The dog lies curled, ears twitching in dream. You lift your own mug, now lighter but still warm in your hand. Mainstream historical fact: in many medieval towns, watchmen or constables made rounds near dawn to ensure taverns were closing on time. Staying open past curfew could bring fines or worse, sometimes a midnight raid, the breaking of barrels, or the confiscation of goods. The last drink was often hurried, quiet, and tinged with a little anxiety. You hear footsteps at the door. The innkeeper stands tall and silent, his eyes scanning the room one final time. He nods to the alewife, who starts clearing tables with practiced efficiency. Quirky tidbit: some taverns had a tradition called the last call blessing, where the innkeeper or alewife would raise their mug in thanks to the departing crowd, wishing them safe travels and good health. It was a moment of unity shared among friend and stranger alike before the night's end. You see patrons begin to rise groaning softly as they stretch stiff limbs. They gather belongings, patched cloaks, worn hats, treasured coins, and exchange farewell nods. The dog stirs, yawns, and blinks sleepily. One man stands and raises his mug toward the innkeeper. "To safe roads," he says, voice rough but sincere. Others echo the toast voices, hoarse but hopeful. Fringe tidbit: in some inns, the final toast was a sacred ritual believed to ward off evil spirits and ensure safe passage. A shared phrase, a collective wish, a moment of peace before the harsh light of morning. You take a slow sip and savor the warmth, the lingering bitterness, and the weight of countless stories mingling in the air. The fire guttering low, the innkeeper begins to lock doors and shutter windows. The alewife counts the remaining coin, a small fortune by her standards. The dog rises and stretches, sniffing the cool air. Outside, the first pale hint of dawn brushes the sky. A rooster crows again, answering the call. The tavern breathes one last time, a deep, tired sigh, and settles into silence. You stand feeling the ache in your bones and the glow in your heart. Tonight you walk through centuries of laughter, secrets, friendship, and survival. You made it through the tavern's many faces, the good, the grimy, the guarded, and the glorious. And as you step outside into the quiet dawn, you know one thing. No matter how far you roam, the tavern will always be waiting. With its stories, its warmth, its endless, intoxicating promise. You tuck your cloak tight against the morning chill, glance back once more, and whisper your own toast. Until next time. The fire has finally died to glowing embers. The laughter and song have faded into gentle breathing and soft snores. The tavern settles into a peaceful quiet, the kind that only comes after a night of stories told, friendships forged, and mugs emptied. You take a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the hearth lingering in your bones, the scent of smoke and ale still clinging faintly to your clothes. This place, this noisy, smoky, chaotic haven, has offered you a glimpse into lives lived fully, fiercely, and often precariously. The worn wooden beams above seem to cradle the memories of 1,000 nights like this one, of whispered secrets, clattering dice, joyful songs, and quiet prayers. And as you prepare to leave, you carry with you not just the taste of ale or the sting of a hangover, but the pulse of a world where every mug raised was a celebration of survival, connection, and the unbreakable human spirit. So rest now. Let the stories wrap around you like a warm cloak. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night. Wherever you are, sleep well.